Welcome to episode 8 of Inside the Designer Studio. Today we have a very special guest, but before I start, let me introduce myself. My name is Veronica Diaz, and my dear co-host is Elliot Goldman. I'd like to remind you to please like and subscribe and also hit the bell so you can have notifications about the episodes that we are about to release. And without further ado, Elliot, please introduce our guest.
So good afternoon, and our guest today is not a designer, but someone that I've known for a really, really long time and has participated in various different areas of the audio industry, and has a really Liam Neeson kind of set of skills, except not in a deadly way for the audio business, as being one of premier setup and installation people on the planet. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Stirling Trayle. And Stirling, why don't you tell us the name of your company and a little about what you do?
Sure. My name is Stirling Trayle, and my company is called Audio Systems Optimized. I've been in the industry since about 1980, starting in college, and came up through various jobs, retail, distribution, big box sales, big box product training, distribution at Sumiko, where we did a lot of training as well. And finally, after many years, I found my calling, my niche in the industry. Had nothing to do with sales. It's all about setup and optimization of audio systems and working with those systems in people's homes. And here I am at 63, crawling around on the floor and loving my job more than I've ever loved any job at all. So it's been really great. It's a great way to kind of end and finalize my part of the industry. So,
And
well, Stirling is who I've worked with before, and I think is really great at what he does. I recommend him all the time because I think, and which we discussed a little in the last video, that audio is much more about setup than buying just the gear. Yeah. And so anyone who's watching this, and I don't mean to give him a commercial, but if you've spent a significant amount of money on your system and you're still not really there, before you go buy more gear, I would recommend that you get in touch with Stirling.
Thank you, Ellie. Appreciate that.
Yes, and Stirling, what is more important when you are optimizing a room, or what do you think in general is more important, measurements or experience?
Well, for me, it's experience, because I don't really know how to use measurements. I'm not technically trained in that area. I do have an awful lot of experience, and I've been fortunate enough to be mentored by some really, really smart, bright people out there in the industry. So for me, it's all about experience, but that's what I have to work with. I'm trying to correlate measurements more and more with what I do. And I'm finding that it's harder and harder for me to correlate measurements to some of the very small incremental changes that I make in the sound that seem to have profound effect on the perception of the music, at least. So for me, it's about experience and pulling that out of the system. Yeah.
It's really good. I happen to agree, yesterday, which has nothing to do with anything, but after coming back from Expona, when I tore my room apart, and then I've got to put it back together again. So I had an appointment Monday, and I got it, 90-ish% back, because that's as much time as I had. So yesterday, I was finally in the mood to do this. I wish I was as motivated as Stirling, but I'm not. I think I'm pretty good at it sometimes of what I own or what I do, but I can only do it when I'm in the mood to do it rather than, on demand. But yesterday, the same thing. I still enjoy sitting in a dark room with a flashlight and a couple of tools and, my level and my foot adjuster and all the rest of that stuff and getting this right. And then trying to document it in a way, it's really hard to do to document it. I made up these things for my sound room, for lack of a better word. It's a jig where when I have the speaker placed, I know eventually I have to move it because I have to put something else there. So I had a piece of cardboard made, and which is like a cutout that which the speaker slides into, which is marked on the wall. And that gets me into the, the 90 percentile. And then you have to start all the little stuff like the footers and the feet and the angle and all the rest of it. And it's really kind of fascinating. I just find it fun. I know Sterling finds it obviously really interesting, or he wouldn't do it. But again, for those of you who have not experienced this, I can't highly recommend it enough. What you hear at a show or what you hear in most showrooms is only a partial level of what's capable, because all of these things are just not set up in a mature way, meaning that it takes time. You have to optimize something for each particular room. And when things are moved around or they're done in a very short order, this is, virtually impossible.
Yeah. Veronica, you asked a good question about measurements or experience. And I mean, obviously both are important. There are objective criteria that we have to try and meet with setup. But I think, I won't say more importantly, but equally as important is what the client is looking for. When you go to a show, you have a system that is set up like Exponent. You have a system that's set up that has to be kind of generically nice. It has to be pleasant to listen to in a very difficult situation. You don't have a lot of time to set it up. So it's a pretty tough job. But probably the most important part of my job is what I go through with my clients before I ever get to their house. And that's kind of an interview process, is what exactly is that they're looking for. Why are they calling me? And almost more importantly, what are their expectations? If I get a client that gives me a call and says, I'm looking for this type of sound, and I try and I probe a little bit more and I ask them, well, are you a musician? Do you go to a lot of live music? What are you looking for? If you go to live music, where do you like to sit in the hall? You want a very intimate experience, looking for a big, broad, grand sound. What are you looking for? And so if I get a client that tells me, I never go to live music, I don't like it. I like the experience of listening in a very isolated sort of environment like my home. There's no crowd around me, and I only listen to stereo systems. Well, the expectation of that client is very different than someone who wants to recreate what they hear in a live orchestral hall, for example, or a jazz club, or an auditorium. But it's a very different experience than someone who listens only to hi-fi systems. Both are equally valid. It's just that I need to know which one what you're looking for. So measurements are very, very important, but so is the personal, I guess, requirements, if you will, of the client.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to ask you, what is the setup that has taken you less time, and what is the one that took you the most time? Can you say the one fastest?
Yeah, I had a system in Austin, Texas that was very involved. It had just so many components in it. All of them really state-of-the-art components, very large speakers. And one of the things that I do when my first day of the job is about 9 o'clock in the morning, I listen to music with my client to get a sense of what their description has been, what they're listening for, so I can put to my ears their description of what they've been telling me on the phone. But that only takes about an hour, and then I completely disassemble the system. And my goal is to get the system back together by the end of the day so I can get it playing to primarily do speaker setup the next day. And in this particular case, I didn't finish setting up the system until about 2:30 or 3 o'clock in the morning. So I was working pretty much around the clock, just trying to get all of the boxes back together in a way that I feel is important, and to get the system going again. So that was an amazingly challenging thing to do that day. Both I and my client were extremely tired at the end of the day. But even on a very simple system, it's going to take me to do the same basic thing, it's going to take me until 6 or 7 o'clock that night anyway. So none of them are really very simple. They all are rather complicated, even if they don't have very many components in them. It's all a pretty complicated process in terms of getting all the things that I find to be important correct in a system.
And if the gear weighs a ton, I think that.
Yeah. And there are some speakers that just have an awful lot of complication to them in terms of what you need to consider to get them properly performing properly. So if you have a speaker like a Divin, a Gerbil Divins, for example, great speaker, but it's all enclosed in one coherent speaker, as opposed to a Wilson Audio, which has all these different boxes you have to get aligned. And they give you some tools to do that, but there's more to it than just what they give you. So the complication of just working with each individual speakers is very different as well.
I was, one of the things you mentioned that I just found interesting is that when you, and again, I don't think it's not a value judgment or anything else like that, because I come across this too. When people don't really go and listen to music, and they're trying to assemble a system, which is sort of that they're looking for something that's in their head.
Right.
Because it's not something that any of us can relate to, because we don't know what's going on in their head. Like I've gone to hundreds of concerts, and I the way I was taught in my background, to some degree, I'm trying to reproduce the sound of live acoustic instruments in space. Okay, that's where I come from.
Mm-hmm.
But having said that, I've seen lots of rock and roll concerts, and they're not unamplified, and they're really not in the kind of space that anybody would live either. Madison Square Garden or the Meadowlands is not exactly what I have in my house. But I think that, just going to ask you, that must be a lot more difficult to try and figure out what this client is looking for, when it may have nothing to do with any reality that we've experienced.
Well, it is, and this is where one of the most important parts of my job is to be agnostic to what my client is looking for and all of the products that they own. Everybody has biases in what they like and what they personally are looking for, but for me, what I like or what I am looking to achieve has nothing to do with what my client is looking for or what they own. So it's very important that I not go into any situation with a bias as to what exactly it is that I think they should have, because what I think they should have is immaterial. Right. What's important is for me to pull out of them what it is they're looking for. And for a lot of people, it's kind of a difficult thing to do. So it could be many hours on the phone with them talking about music and what they're looking for before I ever go to their house. And that's really important from my perspective, what I do in my job, because I really do need to understand what it is that they're looking for. Right. Otherwise, I'm just going there to put a stereo system together, and that's not really the same as putting a music system together.
I agree.
Very true.
Yeah.
So what about if we start with the light part of our interview? I'm going to ask you a very simple question. Yeah. What sound do you like? Do you love?
What sound do I like?
And you love?
Well, for me personally, I like the sound of a, as Elliot described, I like the sound of an acoustic space, like an orchestral hall, with a full orchestra in front of me. I love that sound. It's exciting for me. I love the music usually for classical, but by the same token, I love rock concerts too, because they are also very exciting. And jazz clubs, I just love music. So when I set up a system for myself, I typically set up for something that would be approaching a live acoustic space, because my finding is that when it does that extremely well, it does most music pretty well. So,
what sound do you hate?
What sound do I hate? Wow, that's a good
Doesn't
question.
have to be an audio sound. I want you to.
Sound do I hate? Jackhammers. I don't like loud, really obnoxious, like hammering sounds like that. It's very disruptive to me. So
Definitely understandable.
yeah,
Not a fan of them either.
yeah,
It's not like I'm gonna go listen to a jackhammer today.
yeah.
Sterling, if you weren't doing what you are doing, what other profession would you pick?
Oh, Veronica, that's a very good question. I've been doing this for so long, since 1980. So I'm not really sure how to answer that question. I don't know what I would do because I don't know what else I can do. Wow. It would be something in the music industry somehow. I don't know how that would be. Maybe in the recording industry. I would love to know more about recording. But this is what I do. So I love it and embrace it fully. So I'm not really sure how to fully answer your question. I'm sorry. I guess
Maybe your destiny is to
if I could do anything I wanted to do, if I had a different body, I'd be a professional bike racer. That's what I would love to do.
Look at that.
But I don't. So
That's a good answer, I think.
Yeah.
Sterling, I don't know the answer to this question, even though we know each other for a long time. How did you get involved in music or audio, or what's your first recollections of music?
I was really fortunate. My dad was a jazz fanatic, and he would listen to music all the time. We had on Sunday, especially Sunday afternoons, and he had this Fisher stereo system, a console kind of thing, and he would just play the music so loud it was unbelievable, and it would just drive me crazy. And he was a jazz fanatic. He loved like Thad Jones, Mel Lewis, big bands kind of stuff. And so I grew up hating that stuff until he took me to some concerts. Now, so I'm really fortunate at my age. I've seen Duke Ellington, I've seen Count Basie, I've seen Thad Jones, Mel Lewis, I've seen Stan Kenton, Buddy Rich. So at a very young age, my dad drugged me to those concerts because he really wanted me to experience it. I'm so glad that he did, because it really it informed me what live music actually does sound like at a very early age. And then that led me to become a trumpet player. And so I played trumpet through college. I was never professional or anything, but I know what it sounds like or what it feels like to be in a big band jazz group, and what it feels like to be in an orchestra. And it's a very different experience than when you're sitting in the audience. It's a very different physical experience than when you're sitting in the audience. So that's kind of how I got started in it. And I started playing around with hi-fi systems, I guess when I was about 14 or 15, something like that. And
it's funny that your background, Louis from Kronos, mine so far of some of the people that we've interviewed, is really kind of similar, because my dad also had a Grundig, okay, and he also used to listen on weekends. My father was a mechanic, and I mean, he didn't have any musical training, but he loved stuff a little different than your dad. He loved Louis Prima, Keely Smith, Harry Belafonte. My mom and dad loved Frank Sinatra and Tony Bennett, and I also at reasonable ages got to hear them in concerts. Were different then. They were more in clubs. They went, my parents took me to these like I guess they were Las Vegas style nightclubs in New York, where it was like dinner theater kind of stuff, if you know what I'm talking about. You went there, and 2 drink minimum and whatever it is, and the performers played. And most of my musical early ones were in these small venues, which is, in my opinion, where music really should be played. But I think once you pass the X thousands and you get into the tens of thousands, and you're in a hockey rink or a basketball arena or a football stadium, it's a very different thing, and hard to. Well, I don't think you can appreciate it the same way. I'm not saying you can't like it. Seeing the Rolling Stones, I would love to see them in a 500-seat arena, but that would never happen. Okay? But I have seen the opposite. I have seen, like, my ex wanted to see Michael Bublé, and he was down here, and we had to see him in a hockey rink. And to be honest with you, it was totally lost. It it's just not the right thing. You know, it didn't work for him.
Mhm.
But I think a lot of us got started really young. And like I said, my family had no musical background. I played guitar. Wasn't really that good at it. And I was more interested in playing sports. So I
Yeah.
kind of had to choose one or the other. I'm not sure I did the right thing, but I still love the sound of an acoustic guitar. And
Yeah.
it's kind of what my thing is. So do you have, this is a question I'm really curious to ask you. Do you have a mentor, idol, hero in the audio industry that you've always looked up to or worked with or been influenced by?
I have a few. As I mentioned, I've been mentored by some really ingenious people.
Such as?
When I was working at DB Audio, we were fortunate to not, this is back in mid 80s, I guess, DB Audio in Berkeley, California. Every week they would close the store and we have all these designers come in and give talks, and we wouldn't sell anything at all, but we'd have all these guys come in and give talks about things. And so I got to see a lot of really interesting designers come in and tell us all about their stuff. Nelson Pass was a particularly interesting guy. But probably most importantly was Dave Wilson for me. He lived pretty close to where I live in Petaluma. At the time, he and his family were living in Nevada, California. And we were a Wilson dealer. So I would stop by and pick up speakers on my way to work if we sold some. And so he and I got to talking quite a bit, and he was kind enough to give me lessons, if you will, on setup, what's important in setup, but also some experiential lessons. I remember once he taught me by far the most important lesson I've ever learned in terms of what low frequency pressure is all about and how it can impact music. And he called me up at work and asked me to stop by his place and on my way home. So I did. And he had this system set up, his WAMs set up, and his Ultramaster tape machine and these big Krell amplifiers. And he said, we were talking about low frequency pressure and bass response. I just want to give you an example of what it does for music. So he played me a solo flute recording that he had made. And he said, this is what the full range system sounds like with a solo flute. That's all there was, just a flute. And he says, now I'm going to turn the subwoofers off. And the subwoofers are crossed over relatively low, 28 cycles or something like that. And when you turn the amplifiers off, the Krell amplifiers off, the flute just kind of went away. I mean, you could hear it, but there was no flute in front of you. There was no perspective to the flute. There was no ambience to the room or anything. The flute just, it wasn't hanging there in space with an environment that was created around it. It was just a flute. You turn the subwoofers back on, and all of a sudden there was an environment around the flute, and the flute all of a sudden made sense to me. And there's no bass in this. This is just a flute. So obviously there is bass. So it taught me about the importance of bass response, a number of things that he taught me, but that was probably the most profound thing, because it has informed me better than anything in terms of how I go about beginning to set up a system, and at least loudspeakers. And so Dave Wilson's probably the number one mentor I've had, meant the most to me.
I want to ask
but by the same token, I also, pardon me?
I want to ask you a follow-up.
Yeah.
Finish. I'm sorry. I didn't mean
I was going to say, but by the same token, when I was working at Samico, I was also working with David Fletcher, who was a physicist. And he also was a great teacher for me in terms of mechanics in the audio and how that involves how impacts the audio system. And so Dave Fletcher was also really just a tremendous mentor as well. So
yeah, this is something that I find curious too. And I mean, I got a lot of early on incredible training, and met all these pioneers of the audio industry back in the day when I was in New York. Do you think that perhaps that this is something that is really missing from our industry today? That I just don't see it. I don't see this apprenticeship, mentorship, educational thing. We've become kind of rigid and technical, I think. And you and I have talked about this, and so I'm not talking out of school. There is a really big difference between hearing and listening, and learning how to listen and what to listen for is something I think that just doesn't get addressed today.
Well, I mean, I talk about this with a lot of people. I think one of the things that's really important for in any industry, and ours is particularly, it's important in our industry, is not realizing there are things you don't know, and being open to learning and being open to accepting that maybe you're wrong, or your view or your particular technique can be improved upon by someone else, or someone else's opinion, or someone else's knowledge. And I think the world in general has become more and more insular in terms of what we believe, and that's the way it is. So I think it carries over to a number of different industries. Hopefully that will change eventually back to maybe a little more open-minded approach. But yeah, I think that we certainly could use more training out there. Absolutely, you bet.